in listen-only mode.
Hey, well, good morning, everyone. Christine Westerlin here, and I welcome all of you listening in on the ICA webinar series focusing on the organizational standards this year. Today, we're going to focus on Category 5, which is board governance. I think this is a category that holds some special significance for us. As we know, the IM 138 certainly has quite a bit of board involvement in it, and I think that is always a good idea to examine what it is that we do with our boards. How is it that we can function or lift up our functionality with our boards and really elevate the work that we do in community action. So having said that, let's just go ahead and move forward. And here's a definition of governance that I found that I think that really kind of encapsulates what it is that we do. And you can see this is that it's really providing strategic leadership to organizations. And so there's all these things that we need to be aware of in the functionality of setting direction. We make policy, boards make policy, strategy decisions, monitoring organizational performance, and ensuring overall accountability. And that really is, in essence, what it is that governance is. That's what it all kind of boils down to. There's elements that we need to be mindful of as we work through the work, what boards do. But it always goes back, we think about leadership, strategic leadership, and what does that consist of? And again, how is it that we're tying this to accountability? We understand that we have processes in place in community action that encourage and speak to accountability, but a lot of this lays really on the shoulders of the board members. So how is it, can we position ourselves as agencies to be high performing? How is it that we're being accountable? How is it that we're examining our results and really begin looking at it from that perspective? So here's what the guidance says, and I know I've made a point of this in every webinar in which we really must examine what this guidance is included in the IM and what it says to us. And just to bring this to your attention, as you know, in the IM 138, they have both, they're split into both private and public standards, and what I can tell you is the guidance for standard number 5, for category number 5, excuse me, is exactly the same. So if you will indulge me for a moment, I will read this to you. Community action boards are uniquely structured to ensure maximum feasible participation by the entire community, including those the network serves. By law, community action boards are comprised of at least 1/3 low-income consumers or their representatives, 1/3 elected officials or their appointees, and the remainder private sector community members. To make this structure work as intended, CAAs must recruit board members thoughtfully, work within communities to promote opportunities for board service, and to orient, train, and support them in their oversight role. Boards are foundational to good organizational performance, and the time invested to keep them healthy and active is significant, but necessary. So to me, when I read through this, this really says we have to tend to our boards. We have to ensure that the board members who serve are well trained. They understand our processes, our structures, our policies, our procedures. They get the work that we're doing, they understand it, and then they take all that knowledge and they wrap it into this strategic approach of positioning the agency to be not only competitive, but to really be thoughtful and tend to the mission of the agency. So there's a lot of work that goes into that. There's a lot of information that needs to be shared. There's a lot of structure that needs to be in place. And so how is it that we can kind of begin working towards that? How is it that we can elevate the work of our boards? Many of us have great board members already. We know that. We know that our boards are high functioning and they're committed and dedicated to the work of community action. But how is it that we can dive a little bit deeper into these standards that have been offered to us and then perhaps talk through some of the ideas that we have, again, to elevate the service? And to be mindful of this is that governance is not management. And I've put this out here because a lot of times I think there is a disconnect in board members when they do join a board, that they think perhaps it isn't quite leadership, it's more as if I'm managing what's going on at the agency, and that is not the role of the board member. That the management piece is up to the leader of the agency, or perhaps the leader of the agency has a management team in place that allows for management. So again, to be very clear about really what board governance is, and to understand that there are certain boundaries that need to be in place as well, and to be mindful of those boundaries. And board members need to be very mindful of those boundaries as well. So the first one we're going to look at, and I've divided these up into, I've made both public and private slides because I think it's important. There is some very little nuanced pieces of this that we need to be tending to. So the first one is this, and this is the one we all know. This is the maximum feasible participation piece, the tripartite board. And here's what the structure is as it's mandated in the CSBG Act, that at least 1/3 democratically selected representatives of the low-income community, 1/3 local elected officials that can be also representatives, and the remaining membership comes from major groups and interests in the community. So again, we all know who that might be, right? So we know who the representatives of the low-income community, that might be some actual clients, that might be someone in another organization, a local organization that works with the low-income community that represents the interests of that. Our local elected officials, that should be fairly self-evident who they may be. That might be your city council, that might be your county board members, it could be a representative of perhaps your state representative, or perhaps even your state senator. So things to think about. Major groups and interests in the community, and that's the whole gamut. You know, that could be, you know, a minister, that could be a small business owner, that could be a banker, that could be someone who represents the seniors. Again, and you know who those individuals are in your communities, and thinking as you're working and inviting new members that are democratically selected, how is it that you could find someone who really understands the communities in which they work, who really brings that knowledge and that presence to boards? We can't minimize that role at all. In fact, you know, and I think about, you know, some of you who've been to my trainings, I've been working actively with boards since I was 17 years old, and I currently serve on 3 boards. And you know, the question does come up often, you know, especially as a board member, what am I bringing to this group? Am I really doing what I'm supposed to be doing? And I hope that there is some self-examination that goes on at the board level. That's where training is such an important piece of this. Let's look at the public side of this. And you'll see again, the language is somewhat nuanced. It says basically the first part of this, in using the word advisory body, again, structured in compliance with the CSBG Act, exactly what we said before. But also look at number 2, selecting the board through another mechanism specified by the state to assure decision-making and participation by low-income individuals in the development, planning, implementation, and evaluation of programs. So this is where our public agencies, their processes are different from our friends on the private sector, in which, or the private side of our agencies. How is it that we are selecting? What are the mechanisms that we have in place for selection to ensure that good decision making and good participation is happening? And I love the fact that the word participation is here. Participation is critical. Oftentimes, board members will join a board with all good intentions and then realize that they don't have the time, or perhaps they have some sort of other scheduling issue, or perhaps they lose interest in what it is that's going on with the business of the Community Action Agency. So again, we have to be mindful, really, who is it that when we're asking or recruiting or looking towards new board members, you know, what exactly is their intention, and to ask that question. And I think that's something that should always be asked. Let's look at number 2, 5.2, private. The organization's governing board has written procedures that document a democratic selection process for low-income board members adequate to assure they are representative of the low-income community. And again, I think that is something, perhaps you would have some sort of guidelines in place that it not only has those procedures, but also how is it that you know and have some assurances that they are representing the low-income community. And I think, again, you may have an interview process in place. There may be a checklist that you have. Maybe they have to provide some sort of description as a part of applying to be on a board in order to really describe what it is that they're doing in the community and representing the interests of the low-income community. Looking at the public, and here it comes, we see a little more nuanced language here in the difference. For the advisory body, the tripartite board, written procedures that document the democratic selection, very similar that we understand, or another mechanism specified by the state to assure decision-making and participation by low-income individuals in the development, planning, implementation, and evaluation of programs. And see what that says there. It's really looking at, and that's the difference, is that the advisory board is looking specifically at programs. They're not looking at financials. They're not looking at some of the other governance issues that private boards look at, but they're really looking at how is it that the programs that are being developed, planned, and implemented and evaluated, what is going on with those programs. And then it also does point to IM 82 for public entities. And if you have not taken a look at that recently, public agencies, please pull that out and look at it again. You can find it on the HHS, ACF, OCS website. And take a look at it and read through it just to get it fresh in your mind about what it is that you need to be doing and what are some of the things that you need to tend to in this process. So 5.3, the private bylaws have been reviewed by an attorney in the last 5 years. I can tell you that bylaws are probably some of the most important, but yet some of the most neglected part of any board service. And let's just look to see what it says here in the public side. It's not applicable because we have to understand that if you're part of a public organization, there are already systems in place that take care of these bylaws. It may be the city council, it could be a county board, it could be another publicly elected board that follows this. But going back to the private, in that, make sure that those bylaws have been reviewed. And I would also recommend that they are reviewed, if not annually, at least every other year to ensure that they're up to date and that they're relevant to the work that's being done by the agency. All right, moving forward to 5.4. The organization documents that each governing board member has received a copy of the bylaws within the past 2 years. That, again, it's critical. The buy-in to board service in community action, and you've probably, as we've discussed in previous webinars, the presence of the board is really a key component to the standards. And how is it that you keep your boards engaged? How is it that the board members understand the processes that need to happen at the board level is contained within those bylaws. So an assurance that those bylaws have been distributed to the board members, and how is it that you're noting that? How is your record keeping in order that you know, are they signing off on something? Is there then a database or some sort of spreadsheet that you're keeping that information in? Are you noting it in the minutes whenever those bylaws are distributed to each board member? So just to be mindful of that. And this also is in the public side, that each advisory member, body member, has received a copy of the governing documents, not the bylaws, but governing documents that have been used. Again, these could be policies, these could be procedures, these could be just understanding of the work of the board. So again, to be mindful of that and to have a place in which that is noted. Again, the minutes are probably the best place to take a note that all those documents, whether they're bylaws or governing documents, have been distributed. Standard 5.5. The organization's governing board meets in accordance with the frequency and quorum requirements and fills board vacancies as set out in its bylaws. And again, this is such a key piece of it. Are you meeting, do you set once a year? Do you say we're going to meet, and maybe you've done this routinely for years and years and years, that you meet quarterly, or perhaps you meet monthly, but you meet on the third Thursday at noon, or you meet on the second Wednesday at 5 p.m. And to note that, to have that in your governing documents, in your bylaws. And what does a quorum consist of? Usually it's half of your board plus one. That's not always necessarily true, but that is the standard that's currently in place. And to have that noted in the bylaws, and to understand that when someone does vacate their seat on the board, what is your process to fill that seat? I think technically you're supposed to fill it pretty much as quickly as you can. I know that there are some time details that are attached to that, but to be mindful of that and to refer back to the bylaws and governing documents when you can. Those documents are there for a purpose, and this is one way that you can use them, and to have them present, to be always there at any meeting. And again, this is essentially the same thing. And so we just really want to assure that the meetings are being met, or the meetings are scheduled, that the quorums are there, and the vacancies are being tended to. So 5.6 is a conflict of interest policy. That is, again, a critical component to board being a member of a board. If you have a conflict of interest, if you're a business owner, or if you have an interest in something that the board is meeting on, you need to make sure that that is documented. You need to make sure if you do have a board member who owns a business, that they recuse them from any sort of vote. I think that's always a key piece, but to be mindful of that. And that's where having your information about the background of your board members, I'm sure that you probably have some documentation as to perhaps a resume, what their background is, so that you understand that if there is potential conflict of interest, that you can talk about it. Perhaps it needs to be brought to the attention of that board member and to other board members. So again, critical piece of it, and it has to be done every 2 years. We, again, we think it's one and done. We sign off the day that we're sworn into the board, and we don't ever have to visit again. Absolutely not. Circumstances change all the time. New things could happen, and to be mindful of that. And we see that that is very comparable in the public side, is that there has to be some sort of conflict of interest policy or a comparable local government document. And these organizations will have this. If not, then pursue it. Put something together, submit it for approval by the larger body so that you can have this as a part of your governing board. So 5.7, the organization has a process for a structured orientation for governing board members within 6 months of being seated. And I know that we offer board training here, but an orientation to the organization itself should probably always be something that's done immediately. I know that some boards will invite in the new members to the agency and have a sit-down conversation with them, walk them through what are some of the processes of the board, here are the important documents that you need to be aware of, here are some recent decisions, some minutes. So that is a good structured orientation to really introduce them to all the workings of the agency, but some of the nuances of the agency as well, so they do have an understanding of what their role is, and doing that within that 6 month time frame. Again, you're going to have a process in place that notes that that has happened. You may want to just, again, simply have a routine meeting. Maybe you seat new board members once a year. Perhaps that you do it whenever there is a vacancy. So again, whatever your process is, document that, whether it is in some of your governing documents of how is it you orient your new board members, and to make sure that it's done the same for each new board member when you are onboarding them. And again, very similar on the public side. Want to say a little bit more about board training. That's certainly something that ICA offers as an opportunity to the network. We are actively putting together a training video that I think will be helpful to most of you, if not all of you, that does take in the differences between public and private boards, and we are very close to having that available for release, that I think will provide another option for orientation for your new board members. 5.8, governing board members have been provided with training on their duties and responsibilities within the past 2 years. And again, this is the same for on the public side as well. I think the one thing too that we see noted within all of the IM 138 is the need for training. Things change, and I don't think we appreciate that as much as we possibly can. We've been in a very rapidly changing environment just within the last 60 days, and we understand that. We've had to really think through some of our current processes. It's true at the board level as well. How is this impacting our board? And so this is where we have to be mindful, is that when there is something new that's coming down, or if there's something on duties and responsibilities that may shift, like IM 138, that there is training provided to board members. So again, they're informed, they're making good decisions, they're able to ask good questions, which I think is probably one of the hallmarks of being a really great board member, is the capacity to ask good questions. If your board members are not asking questions, to me that's a signal that perhaps they're not getting the right documentation, perhaps they're not really looking at the right things, and that might be a good time to have an orientation. So again, on the private side, or on the public side, excuse me, exactly the same. Excuse me. So 5.9. Programmatic reports at regular board meetings. This is really, as a board member, this is what you're interested in. You know, you're interested in the fiscal reports. You're interested in hearing what's going on in other areas of the agency, but it's the programs. This is the accountability piece alongside with the fiscal reporting on the private side. What's going on in the programs? How many individuals are we serving? Are there issues with each of those programs that we need to be made aware of? What are the customer surveys saying? Are we providing good service? These are the types of things that need to be discussed at the board level. That's where these programmatic reports are critical to the success of the agency. This is the accountability piece, just over and over again. So how is it that you're reporting on your LIHEAP program, your weatherization program, your food pantry program, so on and so forth? And think about putting those reports or structuring those reports to be presented in a way that are understandable. There's not a lot of acronyms or jargon, so the board member can really get it. And again, ask those critical questions, because that is the key to success for board service. And we see it as being exactly the same for the public side. They're receiving regular programmatic reports at regular board meetings and advisory meetings. This is something you say, well, once a year I'm going to give you a report on CSBG, or I'm going to give you a report. Again, it should always be provided at regular meetings. So having heard all of this and kind of rushing through those 9, because I know that you're very familiar with these, here is what we've been putting together as a to-do list. It's something that will help guide your thinking. So ensure that your board is structured for maximum feasible participation, the tripartite structure. What is your process for orientation and training? Review that. If your board has not been trained within the past, we'll say year and a half, 2 years, think about putting together an orientation or some sort of training to really get everyone on the same page so they are in the same conversation with one another. Meeting minutes, this is critical for accountability. This is what's going to be reviewed to see what decisions have been made at the board level, what's the quality of the conversation. Make sure they're accurate. Make sure it's recording everything that needs to be said. For example, when the community needs assessment is presented, make sure that is included in the board minutes. So that way there is a pathway, a chain of information that's being put together that does indicate accountability and that appropriate board service is in place at the agency. That also speaks to the conflict of interest statement, that it has been reviewed and signed. You have this down as a rule. You do that every other May. That is exactly what it's done. That you're constantly reviewing bylaws that you're for governing or your governing documents, including those quorum requirements. And again, being mindful of attendance at meetings, looking at who are regular attendees, and just examining perhaps some of the signals that maybe there is change that's needed. Providing clear and understandable reports. I have to tell you that I have been at board meetings in which I have been given reports that I have no idea what they mean. And so you have to ask clarifying questions. And sometimes as a board member, they may not be asking questions because they don't get what they're looking at, and they may not be willing to ask that. So perhaps ask, are you seeing anything in this report that you have questions about? Again, it's critical. Questions are critical. I can't say that enough. I think one great idea for any board members, they want to tour facilities, or perhaps you have meetings within your facilities, or if you have multiple facilities, maybe you move them around a little bit so they can have more of an idea of what exactly it is they're representing. To me, an annual tour is probably a good idea. It might be something that you include in a new board member orientation, but to have that as an active part of your process. And then to be open to ideas and suggestions from board members. That's why they're there. They're there because they bring their expertise, their insight, their wisdom to board service. And so be open to these ideas. There may be some really wonderful new approaches that could be shared that I think are critical to improving the quality of the work that Community Action does in the state of Illinois. So a couple of places for you to find out more information. BoardSource is really my go-to whenever I have a question or I'm puzzling through some issue on boards, board service, or want to know more about something. Maybe there's a decision that's made that I don't really understand, or perhaps what are the questions I should be asking. I look to BoardSource. There's a lot of great free information at this site. And then, of course, our go-to place for board governance is CapLaw. And of course, many of you are familiar with their work, and I would recommend that you go there. So our next webinar will be focusing on Category 6 Strategic Planning in September on the 16th at 10. So I look forward to that webinar with all of you. And again, I will try to keep these at about a half an hour, so we just kind of have this opportunity. If you need, I have been recording this, so if you need this, I'd be happy to send it along to you so you can share it, or if you need to listen into it again. I hope that you have found some good knowledge and some good ideas as a part of this webinar. And thank you so much for your attendance today. I appreciate it, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.